Okay, for instance, like African yoga, its true name is Smai Tawi. Okay, so when you're dealing with that aspect, you're talking about ancient Egypt. That's really what you're talking about. So the ancient Egyptians used the terminology Smai, meaning science of breath. That's basically what it means, science of breath. And when you get into the whole kind of background of the ancient Egyptians or those particular people who practice that, you're talking about the actual Hariheb or Keriheb, which is the priesthood of ancient Egypt. And there were various priesthoods that did various roles. And the Ereheb, they were known as funerary priests. They prepared people for the next life and so forth. And the practice of Smai, which is their term for union, because that's what it actually means. The practice of this technique or method or skill was the use of the lungs. Today people call this, breathology, transformative breathing or transformational breathing. These are terminologies that we use actually for Smai, particularly different techniques of breathing in order to transform a person, to transform their bodies, to transform them on a metaphysical level. And this is what they practice, this is what they taught. So you have what was called the Heriheb, who practiced Smai. And this was originally the yogic practice, the yogic system. First and foremost in ancient Africa was breath work. Postures, movements that are found on temple walls in ancient Egypt, like the temples in Luxor, various temples all going down the Nile into Aswan. These postures particularly were found on the temple walls. Postures of particular pharaohs, particular what people call deities. But in ancient Egypt, they were not just known as deities, they were actually people. And these people were masters who represented certain principles. And the principles are representations of elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and ether. So they represented various things. For example, Shu. Shu would have been the master of aerodynamics. He would have been the master of lightness, the master of being dealing with the air. Anything to do with air, Shu was the master of that. So today, you have things like, you have movies like called Avatar and The Last Airbender and things like that. Shu would have been a master of air, bending air and so forth. So anything to do with aerodynamics, he was the principal person to learn from. The principal, I suppose, what people call deity or ancestor to engage in, so that you could master that particular element and deal with that element and engage with that element and allow that element to grow within you, so that you could do certain things with your body, or you could heal yourself through the breath, through the air, and so on and so on. Now, going into like certain differences, there are very few differences in fact. There are actually more similarities than there are differences. But of course, most of the time people want to know what is the difference. First of all, location is the difference. You know, you have a practice that originated in Africa, and you have certain practices that came out of India. So practices that originated in Africa in terms of the yogic system are all along the Nile Valley, which is Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda. So that gave birth to all the Smile practices, yogic practices along the Nile Valley. So you have that. Then you have practices along the, is it the Ganges?
Mm-hmm.
The Ganges, which is also another river. Another, you know, there's strategic people who lived along the rivers tend to develop certain ways of living, certain practices, certain ways of farming, and so on and so on, which fed into their lifestyle. Also, people who live along, they say that people who live close to water tend to be more intelligent, tend to be more calmer, tend to be more agreeable than people who don't. So generally they would have developed a form of yogic philosophy, yogic practices, communion with the earth, communion with the elements, and so on and so on. There's a story that goes that in ancient Egypt, it's not a story actually, this is a reality in essence. The story that goes is that during the invasions of ancient Egypt and during wars, many of the priesthood had actually fled. They had left Egypt and they were going to colonies. They were hiding out in certain colonies, and one of them being India. Yes, India was a colony of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, or one of the names is Tamaray, Kemet. It went through Mitzrayim, Misra, also Kush, which is further down into Ethiopia. And all that area was really known as ancient Egypt. So Ethiopia was included in that. Before there was an Egypt, there was an Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was known as Kush. And India, before India was named India, it was known as Indus Kush, which basically meant, that reminded me of something. But it basically meant that India, or the continent of India, or that landmass, was a colony of Ethiopia, or a colony of Kush, being known as Indus Kush. What I remembered was that you have the Nile Valley and you have the Indus Valley. That's the term I meant to say. So not the Ganges, but the Indus Valley. And there was development amongst the civilizations rose amongst the Nile Valley, along the Nile Valley rather, and along the Indus Valley. So you have Indus Kush. So these priesthood, they fled to Indus Kush and they developed their practices